Good morning, class. Today we will finish this week's interactive read aloud of Nim and the war effort. Let's continue. Outside the Washington Irving School, the police officers were just getting into the police car and the paddy wagon. Nim rushed out to wave goodbye, shouting, thank you for helping me." It was late. Nim hurried home, pulling her empty wagon. She almost ran into Garland Stevenson, making his last trip before the end of the contest. His wagon was overloaded, and he had to steady it as he pulled it slowly toward the auditorium door. With a self-satisfied grin, Garland said, "Did you bring any more newspapers?" "As if you could ever beat me." Nim smiled mysteriously and said, "A few." "Did you see how big my stacks are?" asked Garland. "I saw them," answered Nim. "What time is it?" "It's too late for you," said Garland. "And by the way, why don't you get a watch that works? It would tell you it's time for me to win the contest," he added with a laugh. Nim watched from the corner and chuckled as Garland opened the auditorium door. Nim raced up the street with the empty wagon clattering behind her. She knew she was late, but she knew all would be forgiven when she told about the Excuse me. Let me try that again. She knew she was late, but she knew all would be forgiven when she told about winning the newspaper drive. What do you guys think? Do you think Nim's family and grandfather are going to be okay with her being late? Let's find out. Well, there's the picture. How does grandfather look? Let's continue. Grandfather was waiting in front of the house. Nim ran happily up to him, ready to share her good fortune. But she saw that grandfather was very angry. "You were seen riding in a police paddy wagon through Chinatown. You are late coming home. You have worried your mother and grandmother," he said sternly. Nim nodded, her head lowered. She didn't say anything. Grandfather continued, "I heard you and that boy fighting over the newspapers this morning. I heard what he said about winning." Nim looked up at him, quietly protesting. "But I won." "Winning isn't everything," grandfather replied. "You have shamed our family. You have brought disgrace on all of us and on your ancestors just to prove that boy wrong." Nim bowed her head, again totally dejected. Grandfather continued, "Go upstairs, sit and reflect on what you have done. I will speak with you again after you have thought about it." Nim climbed the stairs slowly. Mother opened the door. Nim nodded to her with tears in her eyes. Still, neither mother nor grandmother dared ask why grandfather was so mad at her. Nim walked slowly to the room the family used as their ancestral hall. She seated herself on the front of 6 straight, high-backed chairs arranged in a row against the wall on one side of the room. Above the chairs hung 6 large portraits of ancestors. They all looked austere and dignified. None smiled. Nim sat very quietly by herself. She was too embarrassed and ashamed to meet the eyes of the honorable ancestors who must be looking down at her in disappointment. The chair was very hard. The only sound in the room came from the ticking of the clock and the chimes that rang every quarter hour. It was 4:30 now. Wonder what's happening here. On the windowsill at the far end of the room were grandfather's prized jade plants, glistening in the late afternoon sun. At the other end of the room, close to the door, stood the family's ancestral altar. As he did every day at sunset, grandfather came to attend the small altar. Without looking at Nim, he lit the incense from the flame on the wick in a small glass bowl filled with temple oil. The statue of Kuan Yin, the goddess of mercy, in its teak and glass case, was slowly enveloped in smoke. The sweet, pungent smell of incense filled the air as grandfather murmured in a short incantation. Then he turned to Nim. She rose to face him. "Grandfather, I am sorry. I did not mean to shame the family, but I didn't do it Let me try that again. But I didn't do what I did to prove Garland wrong. I wanted to bring honor to the family. Garland said an American would win the contest, and he was right. An American did win. I was born here. I am the American who won. Grandfather looked thoughtfully at Nim. She was crying quietly, her head bowed. Grandfather reached for the pin with the American flag and the Chinese flag that he wore on his lapel. He took it off and pinned it on Nim. She looked up slowly, touching the pin lightly. Grandfather handed her his handkerchief. Come along now. If we hurry, we can stop by the school to see the newspapers before you have to go to Chinese school. He put on his hat. Nim made a quick trip to the dining room to get her Chinese school box. As she took a big gulp of milk and picked up her cookies, she looked at the newspaper on the sideboard. Grandfather, are you finished with this? She asked. We need it for the war effort, you know. Grandfather sighed. He really wasn't done with it, but he picked it up and tucked it under his arm. As they left the house, Nim shyly took Grandfather's hand. Along the way, she told him about the newspapers in the garage and the help from the policeman. But as much as she wanted to, she didn't tell him how exciting it was to ride through Chinatown in the police paddy wagon. When they got to the school, they stood in the auditorium doorway to look at all the newspapers stacked against the walls and the piles of papers with her name on them filling the middle of the auditorium. Grandfather handed the newspaper to Nim. Be gracious in your moment of triumph, he instructed. Taking the newspaper, Nim walked to Garland's stacks. She stood on tiptoe and reached up and placed it on top of the piles. Deliberately, she smoothed and squared it before she looked over her shoulder and flashed Grandfather an impish smile. Grandfather looked pleased. Now, we must hurry if you are to be on time for Chinese school, my American grandchild. And that is the end of this week's Interactive Read Aloud. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know I did too. Please make sure you answer today's comprehension question. Have a great day of learning, everyone.